Okay, so the subject is planting mission-shaped churches. And that's a subject I was given. I'm not sure I necessarily would have chosen it, but actually it's been fascinating to think around that particular topic. And there is a context, this is onto the first major slide, there is a context for mission-shaped, which I want to share with you. And it goes all the way back to the work of Leslie Newbigin. Now, I don't know if you all know Leslie Newbigin, but he was a missiologist who had spent most of his life in India as a missionary. And when he returned to England to teach in his retirement, he was astounded to discover that the land he had left as a young missionary was utterly transformed. And he was trying to figure out, well, what has happened in this period of time? Now, it had some indication that something was happening because even in the context of India, he had sometimes run into young people, particularly in the 1960s, who were on the hippie trail and seeking spiritual enlightenment. And it had struck him as a bit odd that people should come to India to find spiritual enlightenment, because his experience of India was, this is a place that needs spiritual enlightenment. So it's kind of a clue when he came back in the 70s that actually something was going on that was a bit strange, a bit odd. And he wanted to know what that was. So actually in the late 70s, early 80s, I came across Leslie and began a bit of a conversation. He was actually a near neighbour of mine, and we began to talk about some of these issues, so that when I went to the Bible Society and we began this project of trying to understand what had happened to the culture of Europe, Leslie was a useful ally, plus he was a lot smarter than me, which obviously helped. And we began to work together on something called the Gospel and Our Culture project. And there was a big conference in 1992, which a team of mine from Bible Society operated. Now, Leslie began with this question: can the West be converted? That's an interesting question, actually. And it was given to him by an Indonesian Christian who knew the West well. He was in the Indonesian government, and he was well-travelled, very sophisticated Christian. And he said to Leslie, is it possible even for the West to be converted, having rejected the faith? So it's not how can we convert the West, it's can the West actually be converted? It's a really good question. And it was kind of the question that underlay Leslie's concern, not just to think about how we present the gospel, which is really the issue of relevance, but how do we engage with this culture, which is actually the question of credibility. Not the relevance of the gospel, but the credibility of the gospel. It's a very different kind of issue, and a much more difficult one. So out of that initial concern, we started this project, the Gospel and Our Culture. And the emphasis was not so much on the gospel and how we present it, but on how we understand what has happened to our culture and how the gospel might connect with that culture in new kinds of ways. And so from Leslie's point of view, he was looking at everything from history to justice, to government, to education, to arts, to media. In fact, many of the things that the European Leadership Forum has also picked up in a variety of ways, Leslie was concerned to think about those things. Now, after Leslie finally did retire, when he was really pretty much 90 years of age, you've got a bit to go yet. And this is the great hope for those of us who are approaching retirement. We keep hoping that we'll turn out to be late developers, and that actually there'll still be a career for us. In fact, some of my greatest heroes have their best contribution in their technical retirement. So that's something we need to bear in mind to encourage us. So after Leslie's retirement, what happened was that the Gospel and Our Culture program took quite different directions in Europe than it did in America. And in the European context, what happened was we ran out of money, which is a familiar theme, isn't it, in Europe? We ran out of money. And so actually, it pretty much faded as a concern because of that absence of funding. In the United States, however, there was no shortage of money, and so the conversation went on, but it took an interesting turn because instead of being a conversation about culture, it became a conversation about the church. And again, that's pretty much what you'd expect in an American context because the church is much stronger there than it is in Europe. And so the theme began to be, let's figure out how we can fix the church, because if we can fix the church, then we can address the culture. Now, I want to suggest to you that that is almost certainly a dead end for two reasons. First of all, you'll never fix the church. And secondly, if you do want to fix the church, the best way to fix it is actually to engage in mission. And you'll fix it in that context. So for goodness sake, don't stop talking about culture. Keep talking about culture. And by all means, talk about the church, but only in that context. Now, predictably, what happened with that conversation was that also began to run into the sand, because there's a limit to how many conversations you can have about fixing the church. And actually, eventually, that also ran out of steam, but not out of money. So the conversation in the States began to be a conversation about the church. Now, in order to make a distinction for the American church between mission on our doorstep and mission overseas, they coined this interesting word. They made up a word, which was the word missional. It was invented specifically for that purpose, because they discovered that whenever they talked to North American churches about mission, they immediately thought, you're talking about overseas. We are already a missions church. We have X number of missionaries, or we support X number of missionary causes. No, we're talking about how we think about our immediate context. Oh, how is that missions then? So they invented this word, the missional church. And out of that has come what we sometimes call the missional conversation. Now, in more recent times, in a European context, the missional conversation has actually come back on the table. It has partly come back on the table, again, unfortunately, as a conversation about fixing the church, but it's also come back on the table in a variety of other ways, not the least of which is, in fact, church planting, and that's quite hopeful. However, if I'm really honest about it, I'd have to say that the missional conversation, which I think is rich, I think is profound, I think it is deep, I think it is meaningful, has really only reached a few academics and a few early adopters. There's almost no evidence at all to suggest that the missional conversation, needed as it is actually making a difference to the, let's say, the ecclesial institutions, our church institutions. I can see no evidence that church structures are changing in the light of the missional conversation. And that's a problem. And let me just give you one brief illustration of why it's a problem. It's a problem particularly for church planters, but here's why. Let me take an illustration from Holland. I know of one denomination in Holland, which shall remain nameless, mainly because I can't pronounce it, which has invested huge sums of money in church planting. Now, that's, for somebody like me, that's incredibly exciting. But when I look at what they've done, actually what they've done is they've created a kind of department over here on the side, as if to say, this is actually going to make no difference to the rest of us. You know, you church planters over here, here's some money, play, have some fun, and actually maybe we'll get some churches out of it, which will be good. But of course, eventually they'll be like us, won't they? Well, actually, they won't. And that realization has not yet dawned on them. And in point of fact, you can't have a serious commitment to church planting without that church planting, if it's successful, having a profound impact on the existing structures. Now, I think there's going to be a conflict here for those denominations that have invested deeply in church planting and where the existing structures aren't prepared for the shock that's going to come at some stage when they find that they've actually brought into their midst many, many churches that actually can't be conformed that easily to the existing structures. So there's an issue there. So we've talked about missional in an English context, and because of the Church of England and its relationships with state churches in other lands, there is also a bit of a conversation around something called mission-shaped. The Church of England doesn't use the word missional much, it uses the phrase mission-shaped. So they're busy at the moment exporting fresh expressions to Germany, Norway, and many other countries through the state churches. And so the language is not missional language, it's mission-shaped language. Is there any difference between mission-shaped and missional? No. Well, you may be able to find some, in which case you can write a master's thesis about it somewhere, and I'd love to read it. But for all practical purposes, there's only a difference of history. The actual meaning is exactly the same. So whenever you see mission-shaped, you can use the word missional. Whenever you see missional, you can use the word mission-shaped or the phrase mission-shaped, recognizing that they have different origins, but actually, essentially, they're talking about the same thing. So, on to the next slide. If I had a PowerPoint presentation, I'd click the clicker at this point. What do we mean when we talk about mission-shaped? What is mission-shaped? Well, because we are products of modernity, we love to look for programs, don't we? So we tend to think, mission-shaped church, that must be a program. So what are the elements of the program? We can learn it and implement it. However, it's not a program. Okay, if it's not a program, then it must be a new model of church. That's our other default position, isn't it? We're looking for a new model of church. It isn't a new model of church. And by the way, I do want to say that those of us who are looking for a new model of church to fix things are going to be disappointed. There is no new model of church, no postmodern way of being church. That's not to say that new models won't emerge, but it's not something that we can invent in some workshop somewhere and present to you as the solution, having done the analysis. That's a way of thinking that has come to us from the Enlightenment. And it's not going to happen in terms of mission engagement with European culture. So if it's not a program and it's not a new model of church, what is it? Well, it's actually a different way of thinking about our context. And strangely enough, the people that have figured this out most thoroughly are actually the Roman Catholics, which is a bit of a surprise to me. But let me just illustrate the way in which their thinking has gone, so that we can begin to get a feel for what we're actually talking about here. In the Roman Catholic Church, they only had two categories for thinking about mission and evangelism. A place was either evangelized, in which case the category was the church, or it wasn't evangelized, in which case the category was mission. That's fairly simple, isn't it? So where there is no church, you send missionaries until the church exists, and then you talk about evangelism. Now, actually, Protestants have had similar sorts of thinking as well, but not quite as sharply divided as that. In the Roman Catholic Church, it's very, very clear. However, what has happened is that in the 1970s and 1980s, the church, the Catholic Church, began to realize that life wasn't quite that simple. And that actually, in Europe in particular, but also in many other parts of the world, they were seeing a new phenomenon where cultures that had been Christian were now no longer Christian. So you couldn't say the church wasn't there, but neither could you say that mission wasn't needed. And so they began to invent a new category to cope with this. Because as you know, Catholics don't like it when they haven't got a category for something. And so the category is called the new evangelization. And that's what they mean when they say the new evangelization. John Paul II, a famous quote, said this, not a re-evangelization, but a new evangelization. New in its ardor, we could say its passion, in its methods and in its expression. Fresh expression. It's interesting. He said that a long time ago, in actual fact. He said that in the 1980s. And it's actually a helpful thing, because what it's done in the Catholic Church is that it's opened people up to begin to think in completely new ways. And if you were to say to Catholic missiologists, so what is this new way? And all they will say at this stage is, we don't know. It's a third space that we can't describe. But we're trying to figure out what it could look like. But at the moment, we actually don't know. And we're struggling to figure out what it might mean. Now, actually, I think that's helpful too for us, for Protestants, because I think that is the reality in terms of Europe. It's not a new mission field in one way, because the church still exists, and in some cases can be brought back into life. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that something pretty radical is going to have to happen in terms of the existing churches, which for the most part have dramatically failed in terms of the way in which European culture has marched in recent times. So there's this third space which we're all struggling to figure out. So, if we're all struggling to figure it out, what on earth can we say about it? Well, I want to say some things about it, and I want to say that, in my view, for church planters, when we come to plant a church, remember what we said earlier, we're thinking about the context in which we're operating. We're thinking about the context. Incredibly important. Because here's the reality about Europe. There are lots of indications that those under 40 are living in a strange and contradictory world, because on the one hand, they're increasingly saying we're either atheists or agnostics. But at the same time, they're saying, but we're desperately searching for spiritual encounter. And they're saying both things at the same time. Now, we might say that that doesn't make sense, and it probably doesn't. But that's the existential reality that people are living in. So, for example, if you take a movement, a youth movement like Steiger, I don't know if you've come across Steiger, it's a fascinating movement. They take rock bands, Christian rock bands, into public arenas, and they try and use that to make connection with youth. And what they're finding again and again and again are two things. First of all, young people are amazingly open to the gospel if it's presented in a cultural form that they can connect with. And secondly, that it's almost impossible, even once you've discipled one of these young people, to fit them into existing churches. That's a problem, isn't it? That's a huge problem. But it just reinforces the reality that we have to think in church planting terms about our context. What kinds of churches would function well in the context into which we're going? So bearing that in mind, I want to suggest to you that as we do church planting, imagine three overlapping circles in your mind. We have to work on three overlapping areas simultaneously as we're engaging in church planting that takes account of context. What are they? The first is the area of leadership. And leadership in this new context is going to look different. What is leadership going to look like in this context? Well, the first thing we need to say about it is that leadership is always more than one. Leadership is always more than one. It's not leader, it's leadership. Now, that's, strangely enough, a shift, because when I trained for ministry in the very late 1960s, early 1970s, actually the expectation was that leadership was always one. That almost regardless of denomination, that actually you might have some lay leaders, but by and large, what was important was the one leader that was going to go into the situation. Actually, we sometimes forget that it was so much orientated in that way, but today, leadership is always about team. And it's about team for a whole variety of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, is the fact that in the complexity of the situation that we face, none of us have all the gifts that will be necessary in order to break open this new situation. But it's not just for that reason. It's also because there's something about the gospel that always speaks about community. Whether it's the nature of the Godhead in the form of Father, Son, and Spirit, or whether it's just the impact of the gospel in bringing into being transformed relationships. We're not called just to be individual followers, we're called into a community of believers all the time. We're called into community. And actually, in a mission situation, leadership has to reflect that reality. Now, there is a dimension of giftedness, and I want to think about that for a moment. Now, you'll know that many, many people who are writing in this area talk about the fivefold gifts from Ephesians 11. Now, sometimes a bit too much is made of that, because there's only so much weight that one passage of Scripture will bear. But nevertheless, let's just stick with that for a minute. Let's just think about apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. Now, you know very well that in the last hundreds of years, that fivefold gifting has been reduced in leadership terms to pastor-teacher. You know that. And there are good reasons why that's the case, by the way. One of the reasons being that in a situation where everybody is nominally Christian, the task of ministry becomes to care for those who are Christians and to teach those who are Christians to be better Christians. The other giftings don't have so much immediate relevance in a situation where everybody is actually or nominally Christian. I'm not saying they've disappeared entirely, I'm just saying they don't have as much relevance. But in a mission situation, they become incredibly relevant, because what's the apostolic about? It's about starting new things. And particularly in terms of the church, it's about, if you like, being the church before the church comes into being. So there's something about the apostolic person that kind of guarantees the church before it actually becomes a reality. It's something about their personhood. It's something about the faith that they have that actually creates the church before it arrives. The prophetic, that ability to be able to see, hear, and understand what God might be saying in a given situation is incredibly important. And of course, the evangelistic is important for obvious reasons. The ability to be able to communicate well in new cultural situations. So these, if you like, are entrepreneurial gifts, which for many, many years have tended to be expressed in the Western church through overseas missions. You know, if you've got one of these gifts, I think the Lord is calling you to go far from here. Actually, very far. Indeed, the further the better, because these are actually quite disturbing gifts, aren't they? They unsettle the status quo in all sorts of ways. And so we kind of want to separate these people out. If we can't actually persuade them to go overseas, a parachurch agency, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? Youth with a mission, youth for Christ, anything but, hanging around here causing trouble. Some people, of course, don't make it into any Christian agency and they end up going into business. and they think to themselves, I'll make money and give money to missions or whatever. And I've met lots and lots of very successful business people who've told me that they actually put their names forward for ministry and they were turned down. And they could never understand why, because it obviously wasn't lack of competence, lack of ability. But I can tell you why they were turned down, because they were disturbing people. In the sense that it was obvious to those who were interviewing them, if they let this person in, things were going to have to change. And that wasn't something that's very welcome in church bureaucracies. Change is not something that we understand very well. So it is a helpful concept to begin to say, well, when we talk about new leadership teams, what do we mean? It's just a useful way of saying, well, what access do we have? Now, note what I'm saying here. Not how can we persuade every church to have an apostle, a prophet, an evangelist, a pastor, and a teacher, 5 leaders, especially 5 paid leaders. That's not what we're talking about. It doesn't operate like that. But have access to some of these giftings. That access may mean that actually it's somebody in a region that brings the apostolic. It may mean that there's somebody in the ministry team that actually only spends a little bit of time in that local church and they spend some time taking other initiatives. It can be configured in a whole variety of ways. So there's no set pattern here. It's only simply saying somehow or another we need to get access to these kinds of giftings, and we can be pretty flexible about the ways in which we do that. It's also important to remember that actually this isn't an exhaustive list. There are all kinds of other giftings that we need in team besides these. So don't take that as an exhaustive list. Take it just as a provocative piece to begin thinking differently about the nature of leadership. There's a very important sense in which the teams that we're trying to create will model the community that we're trying to bring into being. They will model the community in terms of relationships and in terms of, let's be blunt about it, a sense of fun. You know, if ministry just makes us miserable, we're doing something wrong. Now, I'm not saying that ministry can't be demanding, it can be difficult, it can be heartbreaking on occasion, but actually, I want to say to you, there's nothing else I'd rather be doing. And regularly, every 6 months in our local church team, we stop and ask ourselves the question, are we still having fun? And actually we are. We are still having fun. Because we're seeing God move in our team and in our church. And when you see God move in your team and your church, you're having fun. Sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's challenging, sometimes it's demanding, but fundamentally, it's the kind of thing that gets me up in the morning to think there's a possibility that more people are going to hear the good news of Jesus today. That gets me out of bed in the morning. Better than any cup of coffee. Though I like the coffee too, actually. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that first circle. And it's something we never stop working on. It's not that we get the leadership right and then we move to the next thing. It's a work in progress, and it stays a work in progress. Leadership. The second area is paying attention to the community life of the church itself. So congregational life, we could say. I've got this little phrase in the notes you'll see. It's an English word that actually even in England we don't use very often. The community that we're creating needs to be a redolent of the gospel. Redolent, that's an interesting word, isn't it? What does redolent mean? See, even those who speak it, well, no, you're American, aren't you? Sorry. Even those who speak English don't use the word redolent very often. But it kind of means it smells of, it tastes of, it looks like, it feels like. It's a sort of mixture of all those things. It somehow deeply reflects the gospel. It's a nice little word, redolent. And I use it because it's useful, because I have to explain it.
It's because you went to school, we went to shul.
I went to school in Scotland, which is where you get the best education, actually. Very similar story. So, redolent of the gospel. In other words, when people walk into our churches, they ought to be able to figure out what our message is, just by watching us. Just recently we had a 60-year-old man walk into our church, and he just stood at the back. And at the end of the service, I knew who he was, and I said, "Malcolm, you've never been to our church before. Have you ever been to church before?" He said, "No, never." He said, "I've been to the odd wedding and the odd funeral, but I've never actually been to church." I said, "Oh, what did you think of it?" He said, "You've got a community here." I said, "Really? Why do you say that?" He said, "Because I see young speaking to old. I see people not going home." And he pointed out to me what I've not actually noticed myself. These are the signs of community. He said, "I love it. You've got community here. That's great, isn't it?" If when we behave in our normal life, people can get a sense of what the message is, something's happening. These last few years, we've offered, our church has taken over a community centre, and we can offer to marry people in the community centre now. And often people come and ask for marriages that aren't part of our church, and we say, "Fine, okay, before we take this any further, come 3 times to church, and then we'll talk." And interesting reaction you get, because these are people that they think they know what church is, okay? And they think they want a Christian wedding service, which is nice, but they actually don't know anything about the gospel, really. I would say in the overwhelming majority of cases, they come to church and end up in tears. And often we talk with martyrs and say, "What was going on for you in the service?" They say, "We don't really know, because we just never experienced anything like this before. But it was strange. I would never normally cry in public." These are men as well as women. So, "Well, do you think it's because you were sensing God?" That's it. I've been looking for that all my life. And I sensed it. Now, we kind of take it for granted, because it's part of our experience, isn't it, that God turns up. But when God turns up for the complete unbeliever, it's a bit of a shock. And so they often start crying. But that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that what we're doing needs to be redolent of the gospel. And partly that's going to mean a generosity and a hospitality. That's why the welcome is so important in church. We're not doing it as a device. We're doing it because it's part of the gospel. And I love it when we have a generosity that extends to regular food. It's great, isn't it? We often have meals, and because it's a community centre and people are walking by, if it's a nice day, in fact, I think there might even be this in our church today, actually. If it's a nice day, all the doors will be open to the park, and big tables down the middle. And it's interesting, actually, because we feed ourselves, and people will just wander in from the community and start taking our food. Now, I could imagine some churches that would say, "Excuse me, this isn't for you. This is a private function." But we love it when people come in and start taking our food. That tells us we're doing something right. If there's a sense of welcome that would cause people to just wander in and help themselves, that's fantastic. That's redolent of the gospel, isn't it? And food is, I think, particularly important. Just think about the important occasions in the Gospels when tables matter. You know, Jesus begins his ministry, according to John, at a wedding, and all the tables of food and everything else, and of course wine. which we don't tend to talk about quite so much, do we, in certain circles. But of course, there is an explanation as to how he turned it into non-alcoholic wine, but we won't go there today. But you know, just amazing. I love the story as a Sunday school child of Zacchaeus. We used to get the story told on flannel graphs. Do you remember flannel graphs? Apparently they're making a comeback because they're now multimedia. But yeah, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree because I'm coming to your home today to eat at table with you. And isn't it interesting that it was actually at table that Zacchaeus' life was changed? It wasn't actually the revival meeting when he was up the tree. It was at table. And again, we see at table on the road to Emmaus and so on and so forth, that people's lives are changed. And you know yourself, don't you, that you could talk to somebody after church for years, but when you invite them to your home for a meal, your relationship with them is utterly transformed. Over table, something happens that somehow doesn't happen in any other way. We are enfleshed beings, and the flesh needs that kind of engagement, that kind of succor, if you like, and something happens in the transaction that causes people to open up, and we learn things about people that we would never learn in any other way. Now, all of that needs to be undergirded by the creation of spiritual practices. Spiritual practices. But there isn't time to go into what we mean by that, so I won't go into it in detail, except to say that the rhythm of prayer and the rhythm of worship and the rhythm of reading the scripture is actually quite an important part of constantly reminding us that God is the air we breathe. That's quite important. Because actually what's happened to our culture in these last few hundred years is we can live quite satisfactorily without God. Can't we? Our neighbours do, in one way. They live without God. And actually we choose to live with God. But that's an interesting choice, because it is a choice. And actually what we want to do is to build into that choice the kind of practices that constantly make us alive to and aware of God as a living presence. Because actually what our culture has successfully done is blank God out. God is not the air that our culture breathes. But when you go to Africa, when you go to South America, and you go to Asia, God is the air that people breathe. And one of the ways in which we reintroduce that sense of God awareness is by introducing spiritual practices as a rhythm and as a cycle in people's lives that constantly remind us God is here. God is here. And that makes a difference to the way we live and have our being. So part of the task is actually creating this kind of atmosphere. So we've got a leadership team that does that. We've got a congregation that lives in this kind of way. And then lastly, we pay attention, well, not lastly, it's all happening at the same time. We're paying attention to our neighborhood, to our context, to our immediate context. And let me just illustrate what we need to be doing here. First of all, we're listening and looking for the presence of God. What is God up to in our neighborhood? Because he's up to lots of things, actually. We had a community festival last Monday, and it was a It was a community festival. It wasn't something to trick people into church. It was it was a community festival, and 5,000 people turned up from the community, and we had all sorts of fascinating conversations. I was talking to one guy, and he said, "Is it a church that's behind this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you know anybody that goes to that church?" I said, "Well, I do." "Oh," he said, "only I live 10 doors down. I didn't realise that there's a church here." But here's the thing: my daughter, who's 7 or 8, has been saying to me, "Daddy, can we go to church?" And he said, "I didn't know how to respond to that." He said, I suppose I could come here, couldn't I? Would that be okay? Isn't that interesting? God is at work with so many people in our community, but we don't know what he's saying to them and what he's doing. And somehow we have to be building those connections with the community so that we can have those conversations that begin to sensitize us to the reality that God is at work. He's very busy, actually. But we haven't always heard and listened to what he's up to. Now, some of the people that are key in this process are actually not members of our church at all yet, but they are the people of peace that we think about in Luke's gospel when Jesus sends out the 70. They are the people of peace who have immediate access to whole networks that we don't have access to. A friend of mine is starting a church, has started a church actually. In fact, it's only about a mile and a half 3 kilometers or so from where I am living, but it's a wholly different world. It's one of these really tough working class estates where people have tried to start churches for years and failed and failed and failed and failed. And he's got a church of 80 or 90 people now, all of whom are converts. How did that happen? He baptized 12 last week. Well, here's how it happened. One of the first converts was a drug dealer. And his networks in the community were brilliant. And when he gave invitations to people to come to things, they tended to come. He made them offers they could hardly refuse. He was a person of peace. Now, who are the people of peace in our community that will begin to open up that community for us? How do we move back into the neighborhood in such a way that we begin to inhabit that neighborhood? You know, sometimes what has happened is that, I'm going to skip a little piece here. What has happened is that very often the conversation with the community has become quite impoverished. In fact, I know many, many churches that just don't have any conversation with their community. In fact, they would even say, "We don't really care about our community." Or if there is a conversation at all, it tends to be this: "Why don't you come to our church anymore?" Now, that's not much of a conversation, is it? Why don't you come to our church anymore? You might just as well say, actually, do you even like us? Or it's another way of saying, you're actually not like us, are you? And that's why we're here and you're there. You're not like us and we don't much like you. We wish you were more like us. Well, this isn't a helpful conversation, folks. But it's where most of our churches are in terms of their conversation. They were wishing their community were more like them and that they'd turn up to their church services. What's wrong with them? Well, actually, somehow we have to have a different kind of conversation. And that different conversation might begin by responding to the needs that we see in our community. And sometimes they're not desperately difficult needs to respond to. We actually did a survey in our area and we discovered that the top 3 needs were these. 1, there's no children's playground. 2, there is no place where people with children can meet and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And thirdly, there's nothing for youth And so we began by providing a playground, because we had the land right next to our building. So we provided a playground. And then we provided a cafe next to the playground. And that completely changed the conversation with the community, because number one, the community realized we didn't do that for us. We did it for them. And it provides an arena in which a round table, the coffee table in this case, we have lots and lots of very interesting conversation. Now, that's not an amazing social need that we've responded to, but it was the need that people were expressing. What are the needs in our neighborhood? How do we begin to change the conversation? And at a very profound level, at a very deep level, how do we ask the question, what would it mean for us to flourish as a community? What would it mean for us to flourish as humanity in this neighborhood? It's fascinating when we ask the question that way, how many people who are not Christians bring up the question about God. Because they might not bring it up in quite that way, but actually many people who are concerned about human flourishing recognize that there is a dimension to life that cannot be addressed without some concern for the spiritual, without some concern for the moral, without some concern for that which we would commonly think of in terms of God. The question about human flourishing opens up the question about our spiritual life, and it provides common ground, because there are very, very few people that don't want a conversation about human flourishing. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean for our community to flourish in this context? Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that in the business of church planting, we're doing these three things all at the same time. They're in three separate but related circles, and that's part of the difficulty of our missionary context. That actually is quite hard to do all these three things simultaneously, but that's the nature of the task. And if we pay attention to these three things, what will emerge quite naturally from all of that is the very different kind of church, which at the moment we don't have models for, which at the moment we can't necessarily describe, which at the moment we can't even predict, but it will arise as we involve ourselves in these missionary tasks.